The sound of my daughter's scream cut through the quiet summer evening like glass shattering, a single note of terror that stopped time and stole the breath from my lungs. One moment she was chasing fireflies in the warm glow of dusk, her laughter spilling across our freshly mowed lawn, and the next I heard a cry so sharp it felt like the world cracked open. I bolted out the back door, barefoot, my heart pounding louder than the cicadas in the trees. What I saw didn't fit inside my brain at first. Our neighbor, Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, a woman who had spent months obsessing over every blade of grass in our yard, stood rigid and wild-eyed, a kitchen knife glinting in her fist. My little girl lay twisted on the ground, her wheelchair tipped onto its side, a dark stain spreading fast across the back of her summer dress. Time slowed to a sickening crawl. The scent of cut grass mixed with something metallic, and every detail carved itself into my memory, the porch light flickering, the dog barking next door, Karen's face locked in a grimace that was equal parts rage and cold satisfaction. I didn't think, I ran. My knees hit the grass as I pressed my hands against the wound, screaming for someone, anyone, to call 911, but my eyes never left hers. Why? Why would a neighbor, someone we waved to on trash day, someone who once borrowed our garden hose, do something so monstrous? In the blur of sirens and neighbors spilling out of their homes, I caught flashes of everything that had led here, the anonymous HOA fines, the late-night banging on our door, the way she had hissed that our yard was no place for crippled kids. Now it all made horrifying sense. But even as the ambulance pulled up and officers dragged her away in handcuffs, Karen's lips curved into the faintest smile, as if this wasn't the end of something but the beginning of a deeper, darker plan. And as I rode with my daughter to the hospital, clutching her tiny hand and fighting to keep her awake, one thought burned hotter than fear: she wanted to destroy us, but she had no idea how far I would go to make sure she never hurt anyone again. The morning had started like a portrait of small-town calm, the kind of late summer day that makes you believe nothing bad could ever happen. Sunlight poured across the cul-de-sac in soft, honey-colored beams, catching the dew on the trimmed hedges and bouncing off the pastel siding of the houses lined in perfect symmetry. My daughter, bright, curious, unstoppable even with her wheelchair, was up early, her excitement infectious as she planned to spend the day collecting fireflies and drawing chalk castles on the driveway. I brewed coffee while she giggled with our dog on the porch, her laughter mixing with birdsong in a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Across the street, sprinklers hissed to life and neighbors waved while loading groceries or jogging with strollers. It was suburbia at its most innocent. Yet even inside that calm, tiny ripples of unease kept brushing the edges of my mind, reminders of the woman who lived 2 houses down and seemed to carry storm clouds wherever she went. Karen, the HOA president, had already found 3 reasons to leave notes on our door this month alone, one accusing us of leaving the garbage bins out for 30 minutes too long, another scolding the faint tire marks near the curb where a delivery truck had parked, and a third complaining about the unsightly toys in our backyard even though they were neatly stacked by the fence. I had shrugged them off, but her persistence was beginning to feel like a shadow creeping closer. That afternoon, as my daughter and I drew a giant chalk dragon that stretched across the driveway, I caught the unmistakable click of a camera shutter. Glancing up, I saw Karen standing on her porch, half hidden behind a hanging fern, phone in hand as she snapped photos of us with a look that was anything but neighborly. When our eyes met, she didn't flinch, just lowered the phone slowly and turned back inside, leaving a silence heavier than the humid air. By evening, as fireflies began to blink across the lawn and my husband fired up the grill, we tried to shake off the encounter, telling ourselves she was simply obsessive about HOA rules. But later, while taking out the recycling, I heard the faint creak of her back gate and caught a glimpse of her silhouette moving along the fence line, pausing as though listening. A low mutter carried across the quiet yard, words too soft to be clear, but sharp enough to prickle the skin on my arms. It was a sound like a promise, or a warning, something dark threading through the gentle summer night. I stood frozen until her shape disappeared behind the hedges, the air suddenly too still, and for the first time that day the perfection of our neighborhood felt fragile, as if the next breath of wind might shatter it. By the following week the fragile calm of our street had splintered into a slow-motion siege, each day bringing a new confrontation that chipped away at any illusion of safety and pushed Karen from an irritating neighbor into something far more dangerous. It started with her striding across the lawn one humid afternoon, clipboard in hand and eyes blazing with the authority she imagined the HOA had crowned her with. Without a greeting, she barked that my daughter was damaging common property simply by letting her wheelchair leave faint tracks along the sidewalk chalk drawings, insisting that playtime must stop immediately because, in her words, this isn't a carnival ground. When I calmly reminded her that the sidewalk and our yard were private property, her lips thinned and she hissed that she knew the bylaws better than any lawyer, and would be filing a formal complaint before sunset. True to her word, a notice appeared on our front door that very evening, an official-looking HOA fine for unauthorized recreational activity, signed only with her initials. We ignored it at first, but the pattern accelerated like a storm front gathering strength. 2 days later another citation landed in our mailbox accusing us of noise violations for what amounted to my daughter's laughter, followed by a late-night email claiming that our porch light's soft yellow hue violated a non-existent color compliance code. I began saving every letter and screenshotting every email, a digital trail of harassment that grew thicker with each passing day, but the neighbors we reached out to only offered sympathetic shrugs or uncomfortable silence. Some admitted they had received similar nonsense in the past and paid the small fines to make her go away, others simply didn't want trouble. Meanwhile, small but chilling incidents began to dot our nights, our trash cans knocked over though the wind was still, garden tools shifted from their place on the rack, and once, most disturbing of all, our doorbell camera caught a blurred figure at 2 a.m. standing motionless at the edge of our porch for nearly a full minute before retreating into darkness. We enhanced the footage and recognized the shape of her distinctive floral housecoat. My husband installed additional cameras and motion lights, but each new measure seemed only to provoke her further. She started to appear on the sidewalk at odd hours, pretending to prune her roses while staring directly into our living room, and I often woke to the faint rustle of footsteps outside followed by the sharp metallic snap of a camera shutter. The tension seeped into every routine: school mornings, grocery runs, even the simple act of wheeling my daughter to the park became an exercise in scanning for that flash of fuchsia and steel-gray eyes. Our daughter, brave as ever, tried to brush it off, but I caught her peeking nervously over her shoulder whenever she played with the dog or drew chalk dragons on the driveway. One evening, after Karen left a particularly venomous note threatening to escalate matters through legal and personal channels, I gathered the evidence and called a neighborhood meeting, but only 2 residents showed up, both too frightened to speak on record. It was as though the entire cul-de-sac had fallen under her spell of intimidation, a silent conspiracy of fear that left us isolated. We debated involving the police, but each incident skirted the edge of legality, trespassing just out of camera range, fines disguised as HOA bureaucracy, words sharpened to intimidate but soft enough to evade charges. And all the while, behind the clipped hedges and closed blinds, Karen watched and waited, her movements deliberate and her hostility barely leashed. We could feel something coming, a pressure building like summer thunder about to break, and yet every attempt to defuse it only seemed to feed her resolve. Each night I lay awake listening to the creaks of the house, every sound a potential footstep, every shadow at the window a threat, until dread became as constant as breathing. None of us knew she'd already sharpened her plan. The night the tension finally snapped began like any other humid summer evening, but every small sound seemed charged, as if the air itself knew something was about to break. Cicadas droned in a restless rhythm, the porch fan creaked with each slow spin, and the sky carried the heavy silence that comes before a storm, even though no rain was forecast. My husband and I had just finished tidying the kitchen when a faint metallic clang drifted from the side yard, a sound too deliberate to be the wind, and a cold prickle climbed the back of my neck. I checked the window and at first saw only the soft glow of our motion light spilling over the lawn, but then a shadow moved, quick, purposeful, almost feline, and my breath caught. I whispered for my husband to grab his phone and stay quiet, but before either of us could react, the dog erupted in a low, warning growl and our daughter's startled voice called faintly from outside, a note of confusion threading through her usual bedtime cheer. We both sprinted to the back door, hearts pounding, and what greeted us was a scene of chaos and frozen disbelief. Our daughter at the edge of the yard, wheelchair half-turned, eyes wide with alarm, and behind her, emerging from the hedge like an actor stepping onto a stage, stood Karen, the HOA president who had spent weeks turning neighborly disputes into private warfare. Her face, lit by the harsh beam of the porch light, was a mask of cold determination. In one gloved hand she held something long and metallic that caught the light for a terrible instant before she shifted her stance. I felt time slow to syrup as every detail imprinted itself, the humid air suddenly heavy with the smell of damp soil, the far-off wail of a siren too distant to help, the sharp click of our camera system capturing each frozen frame. "Stop right there," my husband shouted, his voice cracking the silence like a rifle shot, but Karen didn't flinch. She only tilted her head with a strange, almost curious smile and took another step toward our child. My instincts roared louder than reason. I leapt forward, heart hammering so hard it felt like my chest might burst, and placed myself between them while calling out to 911, words tumbling in a frantic rush that barely sounded like my own voice. The dispatcher's calm questions: "Is she armed? Are you safe? Can you secure the door?" Barely registered as I locked eyes with the figure in front of me, every muscle tensed for whatever might come next. For a long, suspended moment the night seemed to hold its breath, the dog barking in short, savage bursts, the red light of the camera blinking like a heartbeat, the neighborhood eerily still as if every house had turned into a silent witness. Then came the sudden wash of blue and red lights down the street, the growing roar of approaching sirens that finally broke the spell. Karen's expression flickered, anger, calculation, something darker, and she pivoted sharply toward the side gate as though deciding whether to flee. My husband shouted her name again, commanding her to stop, but she darted sideways, only to be met by the blinding sweep of a police cruiser's spotlight as it skidded to the curb. Officers poured into the yard with drawn voices and precise movements, their presence transforming the atmosphere from isolated terror to controlled urgency. One officer gently steered our daughter toward the porch while another trained a flashlight on Karen, who now stood rigid and silent, whatever she had been holding lying hidden in the grass. Commands filled the night: "Hands where we can see them. Step back. Drop anything in your hand." Layered over the barking dog and the hiss of our sprinklers suddenly kicking on as if the whole yard itself were in alarm. Karen hesitated, eyes darting between us and the officers, but the flash of multiple body cams and the firm cadence of authority finally broke her defiance. She lowered her arm and allowed the officers to guide her toward the gate, her movement stiff and unrepentant. Even as she was led away, she kept her gaze locked on me with a look that sent a fresh chill through my spine, not fear, but a quiet, venomous promise. Neighbors began to spill from their houses, drawn by the lights and sirens, their faces pale and astonished as they took in the scene they had all somehow sensed was brewing but never dared to confront. Statements were given, evidence photographed, and the yard slowly emptied until only the hum of the porch light and the distant crackle of police radios remained. Through it all my daughter stayed brave, recounting in a trembling but steady voice how she'd seen Karen moving along the fence line and heard a soft scrape before realizing someone was right behind her. The officers assured us she was safe now and that charges would follow, but even as relief flooded in, another feeling settled deeper. This night wasn't just an ending, it was the start of a longer fight for justice. Standing on the porch in the hush after everyone left, I could still sense the weight of Karen's final stare, as if her presence lingered in the humid air, and I knew with unshakable certainty that the battle we had feared for weeks had only just begun. The hours that followed felt both endless and frantic, a blur of ambulance lights, echoing hospital corridors, and the relentless churn of questions from every direction as we fought to protect our daughter and piece together the truth of what had happened. By the time dawn began to smudge the horizon with pale streaks of gray, I had memorized every squeak of the ER's linoleum floors and every distant chime of the nurses' monitors, each sound a reminder that our lives had pivoted overnight. Police officers came and went in rotating pairs, their notepads filling with statements and time stamps while our own phones buzzed with messages from worried neighbors and curious reporters, but my focus never wavered from my daughter's calm, brave face as she lay in the hospital bed recounting her story to a detective with remarkable clarity for someone who had been through such a terrifying ordeal. She explained how she'd first noticed a flicker of movement by the hedge, then the soft scrape of a gate latch, before seeing Karen emerge. Her voice trembled only when she described the cold intent in Karen's eyes, a detail that made even the seasoned detective pause. Meanwhile, my husband stepped into a nearby conference room with another team of officers to review the footage from our security system, and within an hour we had something crucial: crystal clear video of Karen entering our yard, moving with predatory purpose, and ignoring repeated warnings to leave. As the officers rewound and slowed the clips, I felt both vindicated and chilled. Here was proof of everything we had feared, captured frame by frame, impossible to dismiss as a misunderstanding or neighborly dispute. But the case was far from simple. Before the morning was over, a representative of the HOA board arrived, his polite smile too rehearsed, his words laced with careful disclaimers about respecting privacy and ensuring the association's reputation remained untarnished. He suggested, with thinly veiled urgency, that perhaps we could handle this internally, implying that Karen was under stress and that escalating the matter might divide the community. My husband's jaw tightened as he slid a USB drive of the camera footage across the table and said in a voice like steel, "There will be no cover-up. We are pressing full charges." The representative blanched, muttered something about legal counsel, and quickly excused himself, leaving behind only the faint scent of aftershave and evasion. Determined not to let anyone bury the evidence, we emailed multiple copies of the footage to the detective, our attorney, and 2 trusted neighbors before the morning sun fully rose. As the day wore on, our living room became an impromptu operations center, buzzing with calls from victim advocates, journalists, and neighbors who were suddenly ready to speak. One couple down the block admitted they had doorbell camera clips showing Karen pacing near our yard days earlier, peering through windows as if scouting for weaknesses. Another neighbor forwarded text messages in which Karen bragged about finally teaching them a lesson, an ominous boast that underscored her intent. Each new piece of information tightened the net around her and fortified our resolve. Late that afternoon, detectives returned with a formal warrant to search her property, and within hours they emerged with a laptop brimming with incriminating emails, HOA meeting notes doctored to justify her actions, and a private notebook filled with obsessive entries about our family, dates, times, and imagined infractions meticulously catalogued. The district attorney's office moved quickly, assuring us that the charges would include aggravated assault, trespassing with intent to harm, and criminal harassment, each one carrying serious prison time. Yet even as the legal case strengthened, pressure from the HOA board escalated. We received a carefully worded letter suggesting that pursuing criminal action might expose the neighborhood to unnecessary media scrutiny, and offering to mediate a resolution, if we would agree to silence. I read it once, twice, then fed it directly into the shredder. Looking into my husband's eyes across the quiet of our kitchen, I said aloud the vow that had been burning in both of us since the first terrifying scream in the yard: she will not walk free. No committee, no lawyer, no whispered threat will make us back down. He nodded, the determination in his face mirrored in my own, and together we outlined every next step: daily updates with the detective, a restraining order to protect our daughter, and a public statement making it clear that no amount of pressure could rewrite what the cameras had already captured. That night, as our daughter finally slept safely in her own bed and the house settled into an uneasy stillness, I stood at the window watching the quiet street and felt a fierce clarity. Karen's reign of intimidation had ended, and the fight for justice, though only beginning, would be relentless and unshakable until every truth was laid bare in court. The courthouse brimmed with a heavy anticipation that morning, every marble corridor humming with the low murmur of reporters, attorneys, and curious onlookers who had followed the case from the first shocking headlines to this final day of reckoning. And as we stepped through the metal detectors and into the echoing atrium, I felt both the weight of months of fear and the hard steel of resolve settle inside me. The courtroom itself was a theater of tension, oak benches polished to a sterile shine, fluorescent lights casting a steady glow, and at the front the raised bench where Judge Callahan, renowned for her meticulous attention to detail and no-nonsense demeanor, presided with quiet authority. Karen sat at the defense table flanked by 2 attorneys, her posture stiff, face unreadable, wearing a tailored gray suit that seemed chosen to project restraint, but the cold flicker in her eyes betrayed no remorse. The prosecution opened with a concise but devastating narrative, methodically laying out the timeline from weeks of escalating harassment to the night she trespassed with clear intent to harm, weaving together witness testimony, text messages, and the crystal-clear footage from our security cameras that captured her movements and the metallic object in her hand as unmistakable proof of preparation. One by one, neighbors took the stand to recount their own experiences: unsettling late-night visits, threatening notes slid under doors, strange phone calls made from burner numbers traced back to her account, each testimony tightening the net and painting a pattern of obsession that no one could mistake for a momentary lapse of judgment. When the prosecution displayed enlarged images of her private notebook filled with dates, sketches of our property, and chilling phrases like "final warning," an audible gasp rippled through the gallery. Karen's defense team tried to counter with claims of mental strain, arguing she was overwhelmed by HOA duties and misunderstood the property lines, but under cross-examination their narrative crumbled, confronted with her own digital trail, emails bragging about teaching them a permanent lesson, a map of our yard marked with entry points. She faltered, her carefully neutral mask cracking as she offered evasive, contradictory answers. At one point, when asked directly why she ignored repeated police cautions delivered weeks earlier, she lapsed into a long silence that seemed to stretch across the entire room, a silence broken only by the soft scratch of the court reporter's pen and the steady breathing of dozens of people waiting for a confession that never came. Midway through the trial, the prosecution unveiled the forensic evidence. The metallic object recovered from the grass matched a tool in her own garage, and fingerprint analysis placed it unmistakably in her grasp. Combined with doorbell camera audio of her muttering threatening phrases, the case had become airtight. By closing arguments, the story was no longer a mystery but a meticulously documented campaign of intimidation that had culminated in an attempted attack, and as the prosecutor's final words echoed, this was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate act of malice. The weight of inevitability settled over the room like a dense fog. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours, a brief interlude that nonetheless felt endless, and when they filed back in their expressions left little doubt. The foreperson rose, voice steady, and delivered the verdicts one by one: guilty of aggravated assault, guilty of trespassing with intent to harm, guilty of criminal harassment, each word striking like a gavel before the actual gavel came down. A collective exhale swept through the gallery, neighbors clasped hands, reporters scribbled furiously, and I felt a release so profound it was almost dizzying. Judge Callahan thanked the jury and, with measured gravity, pronounced the sentence: a lengthy prison term with no chance of early release, mandatory psychological evaluation, and a lifetime restraining order protecting our family. In that instant, months of fear and sleepless nights dissolved into a quiet, hard-won peace. Karen remained motionless as deputies approached, but when the handcuffs clicked shut and she was led away through the side door, she turned her head just enough to cast one last, empty glance back at us, a look drained of the menace it once held, now only a hollow echo of a power she no longer possessed. The courtroom emptied slowly as well-wishers offered hugs and quiet words of relief, and as we stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, the air felt startlingly clean, the sky impossibly wide, as if the world itself had been waiting to breathe again. Our daughter, safe between us, squeezed our hands and whispered, "It's finally over," and for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed her. The weeks following the verdict unfolded like the slow lifting of a heavy storm, each sunrise a little brighter as the weight of fear gradually gave way to cautious relief, and though our daughter still startled at sudden noises and we all checked the locks more than once before bed, there was a new steadiness in our home, a rhythm of ordinary life returning that felt almost miraculous after so many tense months. Neighbors who had once stayed behind closed curtains began to visit with casseroles and shy apologies, confessing how they too had felt trapped by Karen's intimidation and regretted their silence. Together we shared stories, laughter, and sometimes tears, stitching the community back together one conversation at a time. Out of these gatherings grew something unexpected, a collective determination that no family would ever again face what ours had endured. Within days of the trial's end, residents organized an emergency HOA meeting, this time not behind closed doors but in the open-air pavilion of the neighborhood park, where children's laughter and the scent of barbecue replaced the atmosphere of secrecy that had long defined those sessions. Dozens showed up, far more than the handful who typically attended, and the mood was electric with purpose. We presented our evidence and proposed reforms: mandatory transparency in board decisions, annual elections with clear oversight, and a neighborhood safety committee empowered to act quickly on genuine concerns instead of petty complaints. Even those who had once feared reprisal now spoke passionately, their voices rising in a chorus of agreement. By unanimous vote, the old board was dissolved and a new one installed, composed of neighbors known for fairness and kindness rather than control, and they immediately passed measures requiring security cameras in common areas, stronger street lighting, and a direct line of cooperation with local police for any future disturbances. As the new bylaws were signed, I looked around at the faces illuminated by the setting sun, faces once shadowed by fear, now open and determined, and felt a surge of gratitude. Meanwhile, our daughter became a quiet symbol of resilience. She returned to school with her usual spark, organizing a neighborhood art day where kids painted bright murals on the community fence, turning a place once associated with surveillance into a gallery of color and joy. Reporters came to cover the transformation, framing it as a story of a neighborhood reclaiming its spirit, and for the first time the cameras on our street recorded something beautiful. Months later, on a soft spring evening, we gathered as a community in that same park for a celebratory potluck, the air rich with music and laughter, and as I watched our daughter will herself confidently through clusters of friends, stopping to dance with the dog as fairy lights twinkled overhead, I felt a profound stillness settle inside me. The fear that had once ruled our nights was gone, replaced by a shared strength that no single person could ever undo. When she looked up at me and said, "It feels safe again," her smile carried the quiet triumph of someone who had faced darkness and come through stronger. As the last notes of music faded and neighbors lingered under a moonlit sky, I realized the story we had lived was no longer only about one woman's malice but about an entire community choosing courage over silence, light over fear. And in that gentle night, surrounded by people who had learned to stand together, I finally let out the breath I hadn't known I was holding, certain that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them united, and that the home we fought to protect had become, at last, the safe and hopeful place it was always meant to be. If you've stayed with us through this journey, you know this story isn't just about one family or one neighborhood, it's about the power of ordinary people to stand together against fear and to choose courage over silence. What happened to my daughter could happen anywhere, to anyone, because all it takes is one person misusing power for a whole community to feel trapped. But tonight, as I look around at a neighborhood that refused to stay broken, I believe something else even more strongly: we are never powerless when we refuse to look away. We stood our ground, we demanded justice, and we turned a place once shadowed by intimidation into a safe, united home. Now I want to hear from you. What would you do if someone tried to terrorize your street? Would you have the courage to speak out, to gather your neighbors, to demand change even when it's uncomfortable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice might be the encouragement someone else needs to stand up. And if this story moved you, if you believe every child deserves to play safely in their own yard and every family deserves to sleep without fear, help us spread that message. Click the like button, share this video with friends and neighbors, and most importantly hit subscribe so you never miss the next real story of justice and resilience. Every new subscription tells the world that communities can and will protect their most vulnerable. Together we can make sure no family feels alone when facing intimidation, and no one with bad intentions ever thinks they can get away with it. Thank you for watching, for caring, and for being part of a growing circle of people who believe that courage and community will always outshine fear.